Hey guys, if you're still awake at this hour, congratulations. You've already survived more than most medieval beauty routines. Tonight, we're drifting, very slowly, into what medieval people believed was beautiful. It's a calm place to wander, mostly because nobody is chasing you with perfume made of animal fat. So just settle in, breathe a little, and let this very sleepy history wash over you. And if you end up liking this kind of quietly depressing storytelling, just remember you can always subscribe, very quietly. In the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't really a luxury. It was more like a polite suggestion you could try to follow while hoping you didn't catch anything unpleasant from the water. People imagined beauty as something soft, pale, and slightly ghost-like, mostly because sunlight wasn't a nice friend. You didn't really want to be tan because that meant you worked outdoors, and nothing said lack of romance quite like permanent farmland on your skin. A pale face was considered attractive, though it often came from spending most of your time indoors near a smoky hearth, which wasn't exactly glamorous, but it did the job. Hair was another quiet journey. Smooth, long hair was admired, but brushing it wasn't a daily ritual unless you enjoyed dealing with wooden combs that had more splinters than charm. Oiling the hair was common, though the oils weren't particularly fragrant unless you count herbal barnyard as a scent. Still, a slow shine in dim candlelight was enough to catch attention. Attention in the medieval sense, meaning someone nodded politely in your direction. Eyebrows were supposed to be thin and soft, a kind of gentle curve that didn't startle anyone. People plucked them slowly with tools that looked like they were invented by someone who disliked comfort. Makeup existed, but calling it makeup might be too generous. Powders, ashes, crushed plants, and sometimes questionable minerals were used to create a delicate look. It was less beauty routine and more alchemical experiment that might or might not stay on your face. But in a dark room with a single candle, everything blended into a sort of peaceful blur anyway. Teeth were mostly left alone, not because people were confident in them, but because there wasn't much to do about them besides hoping they didn't fall out too early. A gentle smile was attractive, preferably one that didn't reveal too much. The focus was more on your demeanor, moving slowly, speaking softly, not startling livestock, that kind of elegance. Clothing played a quiet role as well. Soft, muted colors were admired, especially if they suggested wealth without saying it too loudly. Fabrics like wool and linen were common, and while they weren't cozy in the modern sense, they wrapped around the body in a way that made people look composed. Draping was considered elegant. Nothing too tight, everything gently falling like a sleepy curtain. Even the way people walked was meant to be graceful, partly to avoid tripping on uneven roads, and partly because looking overly energetic was frowned upon. Overall, medieval beauty wasn't about standing out. It was about blending into the softly lit world around you, keeping movements gentle, and appearing as though you lived a life free from weather, stress, and heavy lifting, even though you absolutely did not. Beauty was a kind of polite illusion, maintained just enough to look graceful in low light. And with that, you can let your mind drift into those same quiet shadows, where elegance was slow, soft, and just a little bit smoky. Even when people talked about beauty, they did it in a tone that suggested they were already half asleep. Compliments were quiet, almost hesitant, like someone wasn't entirely sure whether praising another person's face might accidentally summon more chores. A soft voice, a calm presence, and a steady posture were seen as signs of refinement. Looking collected was more attractive than looking excited, because excitement usually meant trouble, or at the very least, spilled ale. Scent was its own medieval adventure. Perfume existed, but not the delicate floral type you might imagine. It was usually herbs mixed with oils, something between a forest floor and a kitchen shelf. People weren't trying to smell amazing. They were trying not to smell alarming. Lavender, rosemary, mint, anything that suggested "I exist peacefully" was considered appealing. Still, most gatherings carried a warm mixture of smoke, wool, and humanity. Anyone smelling faintly of cleanliness already stood out more than necessary. Hands were a subtle measure of beauty too. Smooth, pale hands with soft fingers meant you didn't work in the fields. But even those elegant hands were usually a bit rough, because medieval life didn't exactly offer moisturizers. Rings and small accessories helped, but even these were chosen with care. Not too flashy, not too bright, nothing that suggested you were trying too hard. Effortlessness was admired, though in reality it required quite a bit of effort. There was also this quiet ideal of symmetrical features, but symmetrical in a medieval room lit by one candle is different from modern expectations. A face that looked calm, gentle, and untroubled was considered beautiful. People liked a serene expression, the kind you get after sitting by a fire for too long. Even the way someone listened, nodding very slowly while others spoke, could make them seem more attractive. Beauty was as much about stillness as it was about appearance. Of course, standards varied depending on where you lived. Village beauty was different from courtly beauty. In villages, being healthy and capable was quietly appreciated, though nobody would admit it out loud. Courtly beauty leaned more toward the poetic: skin like milk, hair like sunlight, hands like fresh parchment. Most people didn't meet those descriptions, but poetic exaggeration was basically medieval Photoshop. There were even debates, small, slow debates, about what true beauty meant. Clergy often warned against vanity, though some quietly enjoyed writing admiring descriptions of noblewomen in their manuscripts. Artists tried to capture ideals in paintings, but their subjects rarely looked like real people. They looked like peaceful, elongated beings who lived entirely in soft light. That was the goal, a face that seemed untouched by practical concerns. Still, beneath the dreamy expectations, medieval people were just trying to look presentable in a world that didn't make it easy. Every attempt at beauty was done under dim lighting, with simple tools, in cold rooms where water never felt warm enough. Yet they kept trying, slowly, gently, and with a kind of resigned calm. So as you drift further into this quiet landscape, imagine those small efforts: a careful stroke of a comb, a faint dab of powder, a soft glance across a room lit by one flickering flame. Nothing rushed, nothing sharp. Just the steady rhythm of people trying to look their best in a world that never stopped being a little bit muddy and dim. And if you picture those rooms a little longer, you start to see how beauty was less about standing in front of a mirror, because mirrors were rare, and more about how someone existed inside a space. A slow turn of the head, the gentle way a cloak settled around the shoulders, the patient posture of someone who'd been waiting long enough for the kettle to warm, but not long enough to hope it might boil. Presence mattered more than perfection. People weren't aiming to impress, they were aiming not to disturb the atmosphere. Even grooming had this unhurried rhythm. Washing the face wasn't an everyday task, at least not with water that had to be carried from the well and warmed over a fickle fire. So, a fresh look often meant wiping your face with a cloth and calling it a victory. Hair was braided slowly, often by someone else, because doing it yourself meant seeing how uneven your braids were and accepting your fate. The result wasn't flawless, but in the quiet dimness, it was enough. Clothes, too, had their sleepy logic. Layers were important, but not decorative. A tunic hung simply, a cloak draped. Belts kept things from falling off. Colors muted into each other like fog over early fields. What you wore said something about who you were, but in a hushed voice, nothing too bold. Even the finest fabrics whispered instead of shouted. Fashion wasn't a performance. It was more like wrapping yourself in practicality and hoping the weather behaved. Beauty rituals sometimes involved homemade concoctions. A bit of ground herb here, a dab of animal fat there, maybe some powdered eggshell if you felt adventurous. Everything was applied gently, partly to avoid irritation, and partly because life already provided more discomfort than anyone needed. The results were subtle, but subtle was the entire point of medieval attractiveness. You weren't supposed to dazzle, you were supposed to exist gracefully, like a well-behaved candle. And yet, for all its simplicity, beauty carried weight. Noble courts judged it quietly but firmly. Songs and poems stretched it into ideals no one could reach. Even in villages, a certain softness or calmness could shift how people looked at someone. Not dramatically, no gasps, no drama, just a slightly longer glance, a slightly slower nod. Approval moved at the pace of a drifting cloud. Still, most medieval people had more urgent concerns than beauty. Surviving winter, keeping the fire going, managing fields, feeding families. Beauty was a soft layer on top of harder routines, something people noticed only when the day finally quieted and the chores ended, and the evening settled around them like a heavy blanket. In that dim calm, a face softened by low firelight could feel almost elegant, even if the same face in daylight would look much more practical. So, as we linger here, drifting through these candlelit rooms and slow footsteps over old wooden floors, Remember that medieval beauty wasn't sharp or loud or perfect. It was tired, gentle, and softly lit. A kind of calm that came not from luxury, but from resignation and a long familiarity with shadows. The kind of beauty that doesn't wake you up, but gently convinces you to rest. And if you stay in that dim room a little longer, the way medieval people saw themselves becomes even quieter. Most judgments weren't made in bright daylight anyway. They were made in those in-between moments, when someone walked past a doorway and their silhouette looked soft enough, or when a face briefly caught the warm edge of lamplight and seemed peaceful instead of exhausted. Beauty lived in motion, not snapshots. It was about whether your presence blended gently into the room rather than cut through it. Even the way people held their bodies mattered. Straight spines were admired, not for elegance, but because slouching suggested weakness or weariness, and everyone was already weary enough. A slow, steady gait made you appear composed. Quick movements or sudden gestures felt inappropriate, like waking a sleeping dog for no reason. Restraint was attractive. Softness was attractive. Anything that suggested you had somehow avoided the chaos of daily life, even though you absolutely had not, became quietly charming. In many households, grooming happened near the hearth. The fire crackled, the room hummed softly, and the tools were simple and a little worn. A comb warmed by the fire so the teeth didn't sting. A cloth dampened with water that wasn't quite warm, but close enough. Someone gently braiding their daughter's hair, or smoothing a sleeve, or adjusting a hood. These were the ordinary rituals that shaped medieval beauty. Quiet, repetitive, unhurried motions that made the person look a little more settled in their world. And there was something almost comforting about the imperfections. A bit of soot on the face from tending the fire, a loose thread on a sleeve that refused to stay put. Hair that curled strangely in damp weather. Nobody expected perfection because perfection required resources, time, and a level of comfort very few people had. So beauty became something warmer, something lived in, a softness of expression, a calmness of posture, a face that looked like it had learned to be patient with everything. The environment itself shaped what people considered beautiful. Winters were long, and pale skin became common simply because sunlight was rare. Summers were muddy, and feet were often covered no matter the season. Hands told stories, calluses, faint scars, small burns from cooking pots. These weren't seen as flaws so much as signs that someone belonged to the rhythm of daily life. Beauty wasn't about escaping reality. It was about looking gentle within it. Clothing colors also followed the landscape. Browns, grays, faded greens, the deep muted red of worn dye. These tones made everyone look as if they were part of the countryside, stitched into it by necessity rather than fashion. When someone wore blue, real blue, it was quietly impressive. Not glamorous, but notable, like spotting a rare bird lingering on a branch. Even then, the admiration was subdued. Nobody gasped. They just nodded in that slow medieval way, acknowledging that a bit of effort had been made. At gatherings, beauty showed itself differently. With more candles lit, more voices humming softly, and more eyes glancing across rooms, elegance became something about composure. The way someone folded their hands while listening, the way they tilted their head when speaking, the calm steadiness of their breathing. In medieval settings, beauty wasn't a single feature. It was an atmosphere someone carried around them, like a faint scent of herbs or a quiet breeze moving through cloth. And as the night went on, the ideal softened even more. People looked their most peaceful when the day's work had drained them, but not defeated them. Faces warmed by firelight, eyes half-lidded from fatigue, movements slower and softer simply because they had to be. In those moments, beauty wasn't an aspiration. It was an accident, born from exhaustion and dim lighting, which somehow made everyone slightly more poetic. So let your mind drift there now, to that slow, sleepy world where beauty wasn't something polished or precise, but something that appeared gently at the edge of a flame. A world where no one hurried, not because life was easy, but because hurrying rarely improved anything. A world where the most attractive thing you could do was simply exist calmly, in the quiet. And if you let that image linger, those tired but gentle faces drifting in and out of firelight, you start to understand why medieval beauty felt more like a seasonal breeze than a personal achievement. It came and went depending on the hour, the weather, and the candle that refused to burn evenly. People didn't chase beauty. They waited for those quiet, accidental moments when life softened around them. It wasn't a performance. It was an intermission between chores. Even social gatherings carried this slow, muted glow. When people met in taverns or at feasts, beauty wasn't about catching every eye in the room. It was about blending into the warm hum of voices, moving with a sort of gentle rhythm, and speaking in tones soft enough not to compete with crackling logs. A person who was too loud or too energetic attracted suspicion more than admiration. Medieval life trained people to conserve themselves, to speak slowly, breathe evenly, and keep their presence from spilling into anyone else's space. Inconsistent lighting also helped. Most faces looked acceptable when half hidden by a wooden beam. And in the stillness of everyday routines, beauty rituals became almost meditative. A mother smoothing her sleeves before leaving the house. A young man adjusting his belt, pulling fabric into neat folds so he looked composed enough to pass through the village square without embarrassment. A girl pinning her hair under a veil, each motion slow, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because hurrying would make the pins fall out. These rituals weren't luxurious. They were just the quiet maintenance required to look orderly, which was often the highest compliment one could realistically aim for. The idea of flawlessness was almost non-existent. Medieval people expected imperfections the way we expect weather: a reddened nose from cold air, a smudge of soot from tending the fire, a wrinkle in clothes no matter how carefully they were folded. These details didn't ruin beauty, they grounded it. They reminded everyone that real life was always at the doorstep, tracking mud into the room whether you invited it in or not. Even when noble women and noblemen tried to elevate their appearance, the results were surprisingly understated. A bit more polish, a finer fabric, perhaps a fragrant herb tucked somewhere discreetly. But even the wealthy were bound by the limitations of medieval lighting. A gown that looked luxurious in the morning might seem muted by evening. A face powdered with ground minerals might appear ethereal in one corner of a hall and completely ordinary in another. Light controlled the story far more than vanity ever could. There was also an unspoken understanding that beauty had a moral texture. Too much self-admiration made people uneasy. Too much visible effort was suspicious. A beautiful person was expected to be modest, quiet, and slightly melancholy, as if acknowledging the temporary nature of charm in a world where rain could wash away half your hairstyle in a single gust. Elegance was measured not in brightness but in restraint. A steady posture, a soft nod, a face that looked like it had already accepted both the joys and inconveniences of the season. And when the day ended, when the candles flickered low and the wind pressed softly against wooden walls, people didn't look toward mirrors. They looked toward sleep. Beauty was something that happened passively, in the gentle way someone settled under blankets or rested their head against worn fabric. In that dimness, everyone looked a little softer, a little calmer, a little more like the poetic figures that medieval artists imagined but never truly captured. If you drift into that world now, slowly, without any rush, you'll notice how different it feels from our own. No sharp lines, no bright reflections, just steady breath, warm shadows, the faint rhythm of distant footsteps, and the quiet understanding that beauty is simply how someone fits into the stillness around them. In medieval times, that was enough. And in this moment, as your thoughts begin to settle into their own soft corners, it's enough for you, too. And if we drift just a little further into that quiet world, you can almost sense how medieval beauty was never meant to be captured, only observed in passing, like mist rolling over stone streets before the sun has fully committed to the morning. People didn't try to freeze beauty into a single moment. They let it breathe, change, fade, and return whenever it wanted, much like the soft glow of a fire that never burned the same way twice. Most of what we'd call self-care today happened in silence. Before dawn, someone might run a cloth along their face, feeling the cool water wake them just enough to begin the day. There was no mirror to check, just the sensation of being a little cleaner than before. A person might straighten their tunic or tighten a belt one notch, not to impress anyone, but to avoid looking like they rolled down a hill. The entire act of preparing oneself felt more like a slow conversation with the day. Nothing rushed, nothing dramatic. Beauty expectations also shifted depending on the season. In winter, red cheeks and noses were unavoidable, and sometimes even appreciated. They hinted at time spent by the hearth or a brave walk through frostbitten air. In summer, a soft sheen of sweat wasn't shameful. It was simply the body reminding everyone that the sun was generous and the shade was precious. Medieval beauty wasn't about resisting nature, it was about existing beside it with a kind of resigned harmony. And when people gathered, whether in a small chapel, a market, or a feast hall, beauty emerged in collective quietude. Someone's face would soften in prayer. Someone else's hair would catch a faint strip of sunlight filtering through a tiny window. A child leaning on their mother's arm created a gentle tableau that looked almost like a painting. Everything became beautiful for a second, then shifted into something entirely ordinary again. That was the rhythm. A rise, a fall, a return to calm. Even courtly love, with all its poetry and exaggerated longing, wrapped beauty in subtlety. Lovers admired each other from polite distances, exchanging glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, but never long enough to be bold. A lifted hand, a lowered gaze, a quiet blush, these were the peak expressions of attraction. Nothing loud enough to echo across stone halls. Everything stayed soft, private, and nearly whispered. The truth is, medieval beauty thrived in dim places, in corners where light softened edges and made imperfections blur into something gentle. In quiet moments at the end of a long day, when even the strongest people looked a little fragile and therefore a little lovely. In mornings when breath misted the air and everyone moved slower than usual, wrapped in the lingering hush of sleep. So as you linger here, following the slow rhythm of that distant world, you might notice how similar it feels to settling into rest now. The air heavy but calming, the light barely enough to shape the room, the mind softening around the edges. Medieval beauty lived in those moments, those in-betweens where nothing asked to be perfect, only present. And if your thoughts start to drift, that's fine. Medieval people drifted through their days too, often carried by routine, weather, and the soft flicker of firelight. Beauty simply followed them, appearing gently and fading quietly, without ever needing attention. A slow, tired, peaceful kind of charm, the same kind that might be settling over you now. And if you let yourself sink even deeper into that slow medieval quiet, you'll start to see how beauty wasn't something people aimed for, but something that passed through the room like a wandering breeze. It touched certain moments, certain gestures, certain angles of light, and then moved on without ceremony. People didn't chase after it. They barely noticed it. Life was too full of small burdens for anyone to obsess over appearances. A calm face was already an accomplishment. Picture a woman standing by a wooden door, closing it softly so it doesn't rattle in the morning wind. Her hair is loosely gathered, not because it's fashionable, but because loose hair gets in the way of everything. A strand falls across her cheek and she doesn't fix it. In the dimness, that stray strand looks almost poetic. Beauty existed like that, incidental, unplanned, born from necessity rather than design. Even the wealthier classes, with their access to slightly better tools and slightly more comfortable rooms, found themselves shaped by the same quiet constraints. Powdered cheeks, faint perfumes, delicate veils. These things softened the face in candlelight, but none of it survived the daylight in quite the same way. Beauty flickered, literally. A single gust could darken a room, shift the shadows, and change how someone looked entirely. People accepted this because they had to. Light ruled more than fashion did. And yet, despite the limitations, medieval people built an entire language out of gentle impressions. A person described as fair didn't necessarily look striking, they looked calm and approachable. Someone radiant simply carried themselves with quiet confidence, like they belonged in their own skin. Someone lovely often meant they listened well, smiled softly, or moved with a steady grace that suggested they were not easily flustered. Beauty lived in temperament as much as in features. Think of grooming again. Imagine a young man sitting on a low stool, carefully pulling a comb through his hair while listening to the crackle of the hearth. The comb snags a little, of course it does, and he sighs, not impatiently, but with the resignation of someone who knows this is as good as grooming gets today. He smooths the ends with a bit of herbal oil, wipes his hands on his tunic, and stands. In the dimness, his silhouette looks composed. That was enough. Nobody expected brilliance, just composure. And in the marketplace, where voices murmured, footsteps scuffed against earth, and fabrics shifted in muted colors, beauty took on a different shape. a merchant's daughter with a steady gaze, a baker's apprentice with flour dusting their sleeves, a shepherd with the softest wool cloak in the square. These weren't exaggerated ideals, they were gentle impressions that settled in the mind like faint echoes. Beauty was not something you remembered sharply, it was something you recalled softly, like a scent that lingered. At the end of each day, when the sky dimmed and all shapes blended into muted outlines, people gathered around fires, small ones in cottages, larger ones in halls. The warmth softened faces, blurred edges, smoothed lines. A tired face in firelight looked kinder, deeper, almost wise. People rarely saw themselves like this, but they saw each other. This was perhaps the most honest version of medieval beauty, the way a person looked when the work was done, when the air cooled, when silence settled. Tiredness often made people look more human, and being human was the quietest form of charm. Even medieval art, with its elongated figures and gentle expressions, wasn't trying to capture exact likeness. It aimed for serenity. Calm eyes, softened hands, draped fabric that looked like it had never encountered real weather. These were aspirations, not documents. In reality, faces were fuller, movements slower, expressions quieter. Beauty was a lived experience, not an idealized picture. And now, as you drift alongside these scenes, you might feel that same softness settling around you. The dimness, the steadiness, the slow pulse of a world that didn't rush. Beauty in medieval times wasn't about standing out. It was about slipping gently into the rhythm of a day, the glow of a fire, the hush of a room. A very simple, very human kind of beauty. The kind that doesn't ask for attention, just a little quiet. And if you let the room grow even quieter, just enough for the sound of your own breathing to feel slightly medieval, you start to understand how beauty back then was almost never a deliberate act. It drifted through the day the same way smoke curled from a hearth, slowly, unevenly, and without regard for anyone's plans. Most people didn't wake up hoping to look beautiful. They woke up hoping the weather behaved, the bread rose, and their shoes didn't betray them by filling with mud again. Beauty was an afterthought, a side effect of simply enduring the world with a little bit of grace. Imagine early morning light slipping through a small, crooked window. It doesn't illuminate the face perfectly. It paints it in uneven, slanted strips that reveal one cheek but hide the other. To a medieval eye, this unevenness wasn't a flaw. It made the person seem gentler, calmer, softened by the day before it even started. The idea of examining your own face in full brightness would have baffled most people. A mirror, if you had one, gave you a warped, metallic ghost of your own expression, which, honestly, was probably more flattering in that world. Clothing contributed to this accidental elegance. Layers weren't worn for fashion, they were worn because walls weren't insulated and weather had strong opinions. Tunics, cloaks, shawls, belts, each piece draped and folded in ways that created gentle lines without anyone trying. When someone walked, the fabric moved with a slow, weighted grace, the kind that makes even simple gestures look thoughtful. A person might pause to tie a cord around a sleeve, and the motion, in lamplight, could look unexpectedly serene. It wasn't vanity, it was survival, reframed by dim lighting. Even sounds shaped the idea of beauty. A soft voice was admired, partly because loud voices felt like they might wake the livestock. Calm speech implied steadiness, and steadiness implied attractiveness. A person who never raised their voice seemed more in tune with the world, more composed, more medieval, really. Beauty wasn't separated from behavior. It lived in how gently someone reacted to inconvenience. A soft sigh instead of frustration, a quiet laugh instead of a shout. Composure was charm. Then there was the matter of hands, the subtle biography of a medieval life. A noblewoman's hands were pale and carefully hidden beneath sleeves. A peasant's hands were strong and marked by work. Yet both held their own forms of beauty. The noblewoman's hands suggested a certain softness of life, while the peasant's hands suggested reliability and quiet determination. A person's hands told their story, And in a world where stories traveled faster than mirrors, that held far more importance than symmetry or shine. Hair, too, had a sleepy elegance. Medieval hairstyles weren't about perfection, they were about keeping hair out of the way of daily tasks. Braids loosened over time, veils slipped slightly, curls escaped when humidity arrived, as it always did. These minor imperfections made people look more alive, more human. A woman adjusting her veil for the third time that morning wasn't a sign of disorder. It was a tiny, familiar ritual repeated across countless villages and towns, something that quietly defined the rhythm of the day. Beauty also lived in the rare moments of stillness, when someone paused to watch geese fly overhead, or rested beside a well, or leaned against a timber beam while waiting for a friend. Those were the moments that made people look unexpectedly poetic. Not because they tried, but because stillness always lends a little softness to the face. Medieval life forced pauses, beauty simply filled them. And at night, when all practical concerns finally melted into the background, everyone looked a little more beautiful by accident. Firelight smoothed edges, softened expressions, made faces glow with a tired warmth. A person sitting quietly by the hearth, their eyes reflecting the flames, their posture relaxed after a day of relentless small burdens. That was medieval beauty in its purest form. Not polished, not precise, just human presence wrapped in warmth and shadows. So, as you sit with these images, slowly, gently, let them settle into your thoughts the way medieval evenings settled into the bones. Beauty wasn't something people chased. It was something that appeared when they stopped moving, when the noise faded, when the day finally loosened its grip. A kind of beauty that didn't demand to be seen. It just existed, quietly, like everything else in that world that asked for patience. And if you feel yourself drifting a little as you imagine it, all the better. This sleepy history was always meant to be lived in the soft spaces between thoughts, where nothing sharp survives and everything turns to calm. And if you linger in that half-lit medieval hush, you start to realize that beauty wasn't something people carried like a possession. It was more like a shadow that followed them when the light was right, and disappeared the moment the wind shifted. A person could seem quietly lovely one evening, and completely ordinary the next morning, simply because the candle burned lower or the coals settled differently. Beauty moved with the environment, not with intention. Most people didn't notice this, of course. They were too busy tending to the slow demands of life, grinding grain, mending clothes, patching roofs that never quite cooperated. The idea of looking your best sounded more like a daydream than a goal. Being clean enough, presentable enough, calm enough, that was the medieval threshold for attractiveness. Anything beyond that was a luxury of poets and candlelit imagination. Think about the way fabric shaped the body. Over time, clothing softened to its wearer, falling in gentle, familiar folds. A traveler's cloak draped differently from a baker's apron. A shepherd's wool smelled faintly of fields. When someone moved, their clothes shifted with them in quiet waves, giving their silhouette a softness that modern lighting would completely erase. You didn't need high cheekbones when your entire posture was wrapped in warm, moving shadows. And in this world, even the way someone worked could look beautiful. A person kneeling to tie a bundle of herbs, a man leaning against a cart catching his breath, a child brushing dust from their sleeves after falling on the road. None of these were grand gestures, but in the right moment, each carried a gentle dignity, an unspoken resilience woven into daily life. Beauty, in medieval terms, was often just another word for patience. You can imagine a small village lane at dusk, the sky sinking into muted blue, the air cooling, the last bits of smoke rising from cook fires. People walk home slowly, not because they want to look graceful, but because the road is uneven and rushing never ends well. Their steps are naturally measured, their bodies relaxed from fatigue, their expressions softened by the settling dark. If someone looked beautiful at that hour, no one questioned it. Evening simply had that effect. Inside homes, the quiet intensified. The fire's glow painted faces in warm, flickering tones, smoothing wrinkles, deepening eyes, turning even the most practical expressions into something tender. A mother sewing by lamplight, her head gently bent. A father repairing a tool with slow, deliberate movements. A sibling stirring a pot while humming a tune. These weren't performances, but to an outside observer, they would have seemed almost artistic. In truth, medieval evenings were the original soft focus filter. Even sleep contributed to this accidental elegance. People slept close to warmth, near hearths, under heavy blankets, sometimes together on shared pallets. When they finally rested, their faces relaxed in ways the day never allowed. The stress lines faded, the breath steadied. The world grew so quiet that even the simplest posture, an arm tucked under a cheek, a hand resting lightly on worn linen, held a softness that daylight rarely revealed. And perhaps the deepest truth is that medieval beauty was communal. It lived in shared spaces, in the way people existed together. A group gathered around a long table looked beautiful in its own way. The soft rumble of voices, the rise and fall of laughter, the glow of candles reflected in cups and eyes. Beauty was never isolated to one face. It was the atmosphere around them, a blend of warmth, light, and fatigue. So, as you drift through these images, imagine that slow, gentle world where nothing sharp intrudes and nothing moves too fast. Beauty isn't a goal there. It's something that settles naturally, like dust on a wooden beam, like the hush of evening, like the warmth of worn fabric around tired shoulders. It's the kind of beauty that doesn't wake you. It lulls you, the kind that fades into the room and makes everything feel just a little softer, a little quieter, a little closer to rest. And if you drift just a little further into that worn medieval quiet, you start to sense how beauty, at least the kind people actually lived with, was woven into the rhythm of tasks rather than the shine of appearances. A face looked different when someone leaned over a bucket to draw water, jaw softening with the weight of effort. It looked different again when they straightened up slowly, blinking into the cool air, their breath mixing with the faint fog of dawn. These shifts weren't dramatic. They weren't aimed at anyone, but in their own quiet way, they shaped how medieval people saw one another. Even the simplest objects contributed to these gentle impressions. A wooden spoon smoothed by years of use, a clay cup with a chipped rim that someone continued to drink from because it still held warmth. The texture of everyday life softened everything: hands, movements, even expectations. Beauty wasn't a polished surface. It was a worn edge touched over and over until it carried memory rather than shine. In the fields, where most people spent their days, the landscape framed their appearance far more than any cosmetic could. Long stretches of muted greens and browns made clothing blend naturally into the environment. Hair caught bits of wind, bits of dust, sometimes bits of straw that refused to leave. Faces flushed with honest work, not decorative color. But if someone paused, just paused, on the crest of a hill or beside a fence, their figure in the fading light could look almost serene. Not because they tried, but because the world around them softened the edges like an old painter who preferred calm scenes to dramatic ones. Inside workshops, a different kind of beauty settled. The rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood, the slow twist of wool into yarn, the focused, slightly narrowed look in someone's eyes as they shaped, mended, or carved. There was a steadiness to these moments, a quiet conviction that made the person seem more grounded than graceful. But sometimes, groundedness was the medieval version of graceful. People admired hands that knew what they were doing, even if they never said it out loud. And in the quieter corners of daily life, you could find beauty in small, unremarkable choices. Someone refastening a cloak clasp for a companion, a child brushing a crumb from an elder's sleeve, a person pressing their fingertips together in thought before answering a question. These gestures didn't sparkle, they didn't impress, but in that slow world, kindness had a softness that inevitably looked a little beautiful. Even the act of walking carried its own sleepy charm. Roads were rough, shoes were unreliable, and rushing was impractical. So people moved with a natural gentleness, stepping carefully, shifting weight thoughtfully, letting their limbs follow a rhythm shaped by terrain and fatigue. There was no place for dramatic strides. Every movement was cautious, measured, almost tender out of necessity. A person traveling down a lane looked less like they were going somewhere and more like they were drifting through a day that had already been long. Meals added their own version of beauty, not the feast halls with their lavish tables, but the ordinary ones. A bowl of porridge steaming in dim light, a piece of bread torn slowly by hand, a shared silence that wasn't awkward but familiar. Faces softened during meals, not with luxury, but with a kind of temporary peace from the day's demands. In those moments, beauty wasn't a feature, it was an atmosphere, heavy and warm. Nighttime deepened it. A single candle flame reflected in someone's eyes could make them look thoughtful, even when they were merely tired. Shadows played kindly across faces, smoothing out lines carved by daylight. A person's silhouette, wrapped in a blanket, leaning against a wall, listening to the small sounds of a settling house, became a gentle portrait of endurance. Even breathing sounded softer, slower, as if the entire world agreed to quiet down for a while. And maybe that's the core of it. Medieval beauty wasn't about transformation, it was about acceptance. The world was rough enough that most people were simply grateful for any moment that felt calm. A face didn't have to shine, it just had to exist peacefully for a few breaths. A gesture didn't have to impress, it only needed to avoid causing trouble. Beauty slipped into those calm pockets, filling the spaces between effort and rest. If you stay in that thought long enough, it becomes clear why their sense of beauty feels so different from ours. It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished, it didn't demand recognition. It lived quietly in the folds of fabric, the glow of firelight, the curves of worn tools, and the hush of evenings where everyone was too tired to pretend. A beauty that belonged to the slow moments, the soft ones, the ones that came right before sleep, just like now. And if you follow that quiet thread even further, you start to see how medieval beauty existed not in any single face, but in the slow accumulation of moments people drifted through. A person didn't suddenly look beautiful. They arrived at it gradually, almost accidentally, simply by staying soft in a hard world. It was the kind of beauty that built itself out of breath, shadow, and routine. Think about the way people sat at the end of a long day. Not upright, not perfectly arranged, just settled. Shoulders lowered, hands resting without purpose, eyes half focused on the fire or on nothing at all. In that stillness, the face softened into something tender, the kind of expression that only appears when someone no longer has the energy to hide how tired they are. That quiet vulnerability under warm, flickering light was as close to glowing as medieval life ever got. Beauty also hid in transitions, the shift between chores, the pause before someone spoke, the small inhale before they stepped outside into cold air. These in-between spaces smoothed away the day's sharpness. A person standing in a doorway, framed by dimness and the faint draft of evening, looked like they belonged both to the world inside and the world beyond. That moment, barely noticeable, held far more grace than any elaborate preparation. And even in gatherings, beauty appeared in the quiet margins. At the edge of a feast hall, where candlelight thinned and voices blurred together, you might catch a glimpse of someone listening, not speaking. Their expression calm, their body relaxed into the chair, their mind wandering gently. No performance, no intention, just presence. In medieval times, that was more than enough. Beauty also lived in patience. The patience of waiting for bread to rise, the patience of mending the same seam for the third time, the patience of listening to rain against the roof and knowing chores would double in the morning. Patience softened people, rounded them, made them gentler. And gentleness, in a world without ease, carried its own quiet radiance, one that didn't fade with age or circumstance. And if you step even deeper into that world, the kind where light never fully wins against the dark, you realize how naturally people blended into their surroundings. A shepherd in a wool cloak looked like another shape in the landscape. A woman in muted linen looked like part of the hearth's glow. A child, curled near a wooden beam, looked like a small extension of the house itself. Beauty came from belonging, from fitting into the scene softly enough that nothing felt disturbed. By nightfall, the entire village shifted into a kind of shared gentleness. Footsteps softened on dirt floors, voices dropped to murmurs. The last embers pulsed faintly in the hearth. In that heavy quiet, every face seemed a little kinder, a little smoother, a little easier to look at. Even the imperfections, mud on a hem, soot on a cheek, unruly strands of hair, felt like familiar details rather than flaws. Medieval beauty didn't hide real life, it accepted it. And as the darkness settled completely, people lay down with the weight of the day still in their limbs. Blankets rough but warm, air cool against tired skin, breathing slow and steady. In that final moment before sleep, every face held the same soft simplicity. No tension, no hurry, no need to impress. Just a human being resting after doing their best in a world that rarely made things easy. That, more than anything, was the beauty medieval people lived with. Quiet, unpolished, and deeply human. The kind of beauty that doesn't wake you up, but gently closes your eyes. And if you let yourself drift even deeper into that slow medieval dusk, you start to realize that beauty wasn't something people ever paused long enough to define. It just lived in the spaces they moved through. A person didn't become beautiful because they tried. They became beautiful because the world around them softened, and they softened with it. Light, silence, and fatigue did most of the work. In the early mornings, before the village fully woke, there was a particular kind of quiet that made everything look gentler. People rose slowly, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and wool. When they sat up, their hair fell in imperfect waves, their faces still creased from sleep, their breathing calm and even. No one looked polished, but there was a softness in those moments that felt truer than any deliberate grooming. A person moving through half-light, eyes still heavy, always looked a little poetic, though they would never have believed it. As the day began, beauty shifted into something more functional. A woman tying her apron with slow, practiced motions. A man adjusting the straps of a basket before heading into the fields. A child brushing crumbs from the table with a sleepy hand. These motions weren't graceful because they aimed to be. They were graceful because they were familiar. Medieval life carved a steady rhythm into people, and that rhythm made even the smallest gestures flow gently. Outdoors, the landscape did half the work. Faces softened under clouded skies. Hair lifted slightly in the wind. Clothes blended into the muted palette of earth and wood and stone. The constant presence of nature made people look like part of something larger, and that alone carried a kind of quiet elegance. Even someone resting beside a fence post, catching their breath after a long walk, could look unexpectedly serene as the world settled around them. But beauty also lived in weariness. By midday, when the sun reached its highest point and the tasks piled up, people grew flushed, dusty, and tired. And somehow that made them more human, not less appealing. There was a subtle strength in a face that kept going despite the weight of the day. A calmness in the way someone wiped sweat from their brow or leaned on a tool handle for a moment's rest. Medieval beauty was not about flawlessness. It was about endurance softened by gentleness. In the late afternoon, when shadows grew longer and the world cooled again, everything gained a different texture. A person walking home with a basket of bread looked almost like a figure from an old painting. Muted colors, steady pace, expression quiet and thoughtful. Children chasing each other left faint trails of laughter that dissolved into the wind. Everyone looked a little softer at that hour, as though the day itself was finally exhaling. Inside homes, beauty grew warmer. Firelight and lamplight brushed over faces, softening lines and deepening eyes. A person stirring a pot with slow, circular motions looked like a calm anchor in the room. Someone sewing by the hearth moved with a sleepy grace, their hands rising and falling like part of an ancient pattern. The lighting forgave everything, imperfections, fatigue, worn clothes, and replaced them with something gentle. By evening, when people gathered at tables, beauty became communal again. A shared meal softened everyone's expression. A quiet conversation turned features warm. A small smile, barely visible, carried more charm than any elaborate gesture. In the medieval world, the soft glow of belonging often made people look more attractive than anything they could have worn. And when night finally settled in, thick, cool, and slow, the world transformed once more. A person lying down on the low bed, pulling a coarse blanket over themselves, looked peaceful in a way daylight rarely allowed. The exhaustion of the day loosened every muscle. Breath fell into a steady rhythm. Eyes drifted half-closed before sleep fully arrived. No one saw themselves in that moment, but if they had, they would have realized how naturally the quiet embraced them. That was medieval beauty at its truest, not a performance, not an ideal, not a goal, just a series of gentle atmospheres that wrapped around people as they moved from one breath to the next. A beauty shaped by dim light, slow gestures, honest fatigue, and the subtle comfort of simply existing. It wasn't meant to dazzle. It was meant to be lived in, calmly, quietly, almost unnoticed. The kind of beauty that settles over you without asking, like sleep. And if you stay in that dim, unhurried world a little longer, you begin to notice how medieval beauty wasn't tied to youth or symmetry or anything so precise. It was tied to atmosphere, how a person fit into a moment, how their presence softened rather than sharpened the space around them. Beauty was never fixed. It drifted like dust in sunbeams, appearing only when the world grew quiet enough to notice it. You could see it in the way someone leaned against a wooden post at the end of the day, the weight of their body settling downward with a kind of peaceful surrender. Their eyelids low, their breath slow, their face unworried for the first time in hours. No one would have looked at them and thought beautiful, not in the way the word is used now. But there was a tenderness in their stillness, a simple honesty that made them look gentle in the half-light. Even chores had their moments. A woman kneading dough with slow presses of her palms, a man cleaning the edge of a tool with a cloth worn so thin it was almost transparent, a child carefully placing logs in the hearth one by one, as though the fire might complain if woken too quickly. These small, softened motions shaped medieval life far more than grand gestures ever did. And it was within these motions that beauty lingered, quiet, almost sleepy. You might imagine a village path at twilight, where the air cools and the dust settles. People walk without urgency, their silhouettes blending into the fading landscape. Cloaks flutter slightly in the breeze, hair moves with the evening's sigh. Even the sound of footsteps seems slower, cushioned by earth. In those moments, beauty wasn't something separate from the world. It was part of the world's rhythm, rising and falling with each breath of the wind. Inside homes, the warmth of the hearth did most of the work. Flames painted faces with muted golds and soft shadows, lines smoothed, eyes glowed faintly, hands resting on knees looked calm, almost sculptural. And when someone laughed quietly, because loud laughter felt too modern for that world, it echoed softly, adding its own shape to the room's atmosphere. Beauty lived in these gentle auditory details too. Slow footsteps, hushed conversations, the faint rasp of wool against wood. And then there were evenings when storms rolled in. Rain tapping on thatched roofs, wind humming through gaps in the shutters. Families gathered close, speaking less, listening more. The dimness deepened, turning faces into silhouettes. Yet even then, in that darker space, something warm rested in the quiet. People looked more human, more grounded, more at peace, simply because there was nothing to do but wait for the storm to pass. That waiting, the unhurried patience, carried its own kind of beauty. There was also a kind of elegance in how medieval people occupied space. They didn't sprawl or stretch the way we might now. Rooms were small, so bodies learned to move with care. A person adjusting their seat or bending to pick something up did so with subtlety, as though aware that the world around them was fragile. This carefulness lent a gentle dignity to even the plainest gestures. Beauty wasn't in the features, it was in the restraint. And when someone told a story by the fire, their face illuminated unevenly. The play of light made them look both older and younger at once, timeless in a quiet way. Listeners leaned in slightly, not out of excitement, but out of a shared wish to understand the murmured words. The closeness, the near-whispered tones, the slow rise and fall of the teller's voice, all of it stitched beauty into the moment without anyone intending it. Then came the late-night hush, when even the fire had grown tired. Embers pulsed faintly, painting the room in thin red breaths of light. People wrapped themselves in blankets that felt worn but comforting. The final movements of the day were small, someone tucking hair behind an ear, another shifting to ease a sore shoulder. These motions, softened by exhaustion, were the purest form of medieval beauty, unself-conscious, slow, and shaped entirely by the desire for rest. And when sleep finally overcame them, medieval beauty settled like a second blanket, not seen, not admired, not even considered, just present. A quiet, human simplicity shaped by dim light, tired limbs, and the gentle permission to stop. The kind of beauty that didn't need to be noticed to exist, the kind that only appears when everything else grows still. The kind you're drifting toward now without even trying. And if you ease yourself even deeper into that slow medieval quiet, you begin to notice how beauty in that world was always tied to the calm after effort, the soft exhale following a day that asked too much of everyone. It wasn't beauty that startled or demanded attention. It was beauty that waited patiently in the margins, surfacing when no one had the energy to resist it. Think of someone carrying a bucket of water from the well, the weight pulling their shoulders forward just slightly. When they finally set it down, there's that small pause, eyes closed for half a breath, chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. In that pause, something gentle appears. Not glamour, not radiance, just the quiet honesty of a body allowed to rest. That was often the closest medieval life came to true elegance. Even the way people listened carried its own sleepy charm. Conversations weren't hurried. Words were exchanged like warm bread, slowly, carefully, so nothing fell apart. A person lowering their head to hear another speak, brow softening, hands folding loosely in their lap. That posture made them look thoughtful, even if the topic was nothing more than the weather misbehaving again. Medieval beauty lived in these surrendered moments, when people let their guard slip because nothing urgent called for their attention. And in winter, when breath fogged the air and the world shrank into smaller circles of warmth, beauty gathered even more softly. A figure wrapped in layers of wool, cheeks flushed by cold, stepping through pale morning light. It wasn't impressive, but it held a kind of quiet resilience. Snow softened the edges of every sound. Footsteps felt muted. Faces seemed calmer, as though winter itself had asked everyone to move slowly and speak gently. Beauty followed that request obediently. Inside, winter dinners made people look almost sculptural. Firelight reflected off metal cups and softened harsh shadows into warm halos. Someone ladling stew into a bowl moved with unhurried dignity. Another person, leaning close to warm their hands, looked like a figure from an illuminated manuscript, glowing softly in the presence of flame. Every gesture became deliberate, simply because speed had no place there. Beauty was a natural byproduct of that slowness. Spring brought its own kind of softness. Mud clung to shoes, cloth, and the hems of cloaks, but no one found it unsightly. It was simply part of living. A person brushing dirt from a sleeve with patient, repetitive strokes looked more tender than messy. And when the first warm days arrived, people often paused in the sunlight, not to bask exactly, but to appreciate the momentary relief from the long cold. Eyes half closed, shoulders relaxed, faces tilted toward warmth. These small acts of appreciation created a gentle, temporary glow that no cosmetic could replicate. And then there were the rare moments of solitude. Someone sitting by a quiet stream, letting their feet dangle in the cold water. Someone resting on a hilltop, watching clouds drift lazily overhead. Someone leaning against an old tree trunk, tracing a small pattern in the dirt with their finger. These scenes weren't staged or admired. They simply happened. But if you saw them from a distance, you'd notice how the world seemed to cradle each person softly, making their presence feel almost poetic. The medieval night deepened everything. Houses settled with small wooden sighs, animals shifted in their pens. The sky darkened so fully that even the faintest torchlight looked like a small miracle. A person walking home under that sky, head lowered, steps slow and steady, looked both humble and quietly luminous. Darkness hid imperfections the way a kind friend might, offering everyone a gentler face to carry into sleep. And finally, there was the beauty of surrender. The moment someone allowed fatigue to take the last bit of tension from their body. They'd sit on the edge of a low bed, loosen the ties of their clothing with slow fingers, and lie back on rough linens that felt familiar and grounding. Their eyes would close halfway before they fully drifted, lashes resting lightly against skin warmed by firelight. In that moment, their face held a softness untouched by labor or worry, the kind of softness no one ever saw in themselves, but others quietly recognized. This was medieval beauty, never polished, never perfect, never loud. It softened people at the edges, hid itself in small gestures, and appeared only when the world dimmed enough for calm to settle. A beauty shaped entirely by slowness, by dimness, by the quiet invitation to rest. And as you follow it now, drifting deeper into that same hush, it becomes clear that the most beautiful moments were always the ones that asked for nothing, except a little stillness. And if you wander even further into that slow medieval dimness, you begin to notice how beauty often hid itself in the routines people repeated so many times they no longer thought about them. A woman sweeping the floor with slow, steady strokes. A man tightening the rope around a bundle of firewood with the practiced calm of someone who has done it 1,000 evenings before. A child carrying a small loaf of bread with both hands, concentrating as though the world depended on this one careful task. These gestures weren't performed for anyone. They simply unfolded, quietly, with a kind of unspoken grace. Even the way people handled objects gave them a certain softness. A ladle lifted from a pot with gentleness, as though disturbing the stew might disturb the room. A cup placed onto a table with a small, considerate thud. A cloak folded so it wouldn't drag dust across the hearth floor. These little choices, made without thought, shaped how people looked, not polished, but attentive, steady, quietly present. In a world without rush, even clumsiness felt measured. Walking remained one of the most quietly beautiful parts of medieval life. The uneven ground forced every step to be thoughtful, and the weight of clothing slowed movements in a natural, peaceful way. People didn't stride, they drifted. Even someone hurrying had to hurry gently, and that gave the body a kind of instinctive rhythm. Small sways of fabric, controlled shifts of balance, a sort of accidental choreography with the earth beneath them. In the evening light, those motions looked almost like a slow dance, and there was the beauty of shared silence. Medieval people were used to quiet, real quiet, where you could hear the wind rustling through thatch, or the soft grunt of a resting animal, or the faint creak of wood settling. In those silences, people didn't feel the need to fill space with conversation. They simply existed beside one another, breathing the same cool air, sharing the same dimness. A family sitting in the same room, each person doing their own small task, looked more connected than any loud gathering could achieve. Fields carried their own serenity. In the late afternoon, when most work was done, villagers sometimes paused to look over the land, not with pride or ambition, but with a kind of worn affection. Standing still at the edge of a field, the breeze moving through their hair, clothes brushing softly against their legs, they looked suspended in a moment that didn't need anything added to it. Beauty arrived whenever people stopped long enough to see the world instead of working against it. And as evening deepened, that softness only grew. Someone lighting a candle, shielding the flame with their hand. Someone pulling a stool closer to the fire with a small scrape across the floor. Someone leaning down to whisper to a child already half asleep. The movements were all so gentle they barely disturbed the air. In that dimness, beauty wasn't about appearance, it was about intention. How lightly someone held the moment. When stories were told, they were told slowly. A quiet voice in a quiet room, with listeners leaning just close enough to catch the words. Faces glowed faintly in the lamplight, eyes reflecting warmth, hands resting still in their laps. People didn't perform, they inhabited the tale as it drifted through the room. And as the story unspooled, every listener looked a little softer, a little more timeless, as though the boundaries of their day had finally settled. Eventually, as the fire shrank into embers, the world thinned into the last layer of calm. Someone might stretch their hands out toward the remaining warmth, fingers moving lazily. Someone else might tie back their hair before bed with slow, absent-minded motions. Blankets rustled softly as people settled down. The room dimmed until it was little more than silhouettes and breath. And in those final moments, when the mind quieted, when the day loosened its grip, when the last bit of light held on like a sigh, every face carried the same simple beauty. The look of someone who had given their whole day to the world, and now, in the hush before sleep, finally allowed themselves to rest. It was a beauty built from slowness, shaped by weariness, and softened by dimness. A beauty that didn't need admiration, a beauty that barely noticed itself. A beauty meant only for the dark, the quiet, and the gentle drift toward sleep. And if you drift even deeper into that worn medieval hush, you begin to see how beauty there wasn't something people possessed. It was something that passed over them, like a shadow moving across stone. It appeared in the pauses between motions, in the soft edges of tiredness, in the low hum of a world that rarely hurried. No one tried to look beautiful. They simply lived, and beauty visited them occasionally, without warning, like a small kindness the day forgot to withhold. Picture someone sitting by a window at dawn, elbows on their knees, watching the village stir awake. Their hair is uneven, their clothes rumpled from sleep, their face still carrying the softness of dreams not fully shaken off. But the quiet way they sit there, the stillness, the slow blink, the gentle acceptance of morning, makes them look almost serene. Medieval beauty always favored serenity over sparkle. And as the day begins, beauty moves with people as subtly as their breath. Someone lifting a bucket from the ground, the weight pulling gently at their posture. Someone wiping a table with slow circular motions, the cloth gliding softly across worn wood. Someone tucking stray hair behind their ear while listening to a neighbor speak. These motions were never dramatic, but the world around them, dim and patient, turned them into little poems of daily life. Fields gave their own kind of quiet glow. In the far distance, a figure bent over rows of crops looked like a natural part of the land, their silhouette softened by the shifting light. When they straightened and wiped their brow, the sun caught their profile for a moment, not brilliantly, but warmly. The warmth itself carried more beauty than any ornament could. Beauty wasn't an achievement. It was a brief alignment of light, breath, and tired humanity. Even in moments of work, tenderness slipped in. A person calming a restless animal with gentle hands. A merchant rearranging apples with slow deliberation so none of them bruised. A woman tying a child's belt, her fingers moving with the quiet assurance of someone who has done this 1,000 mornings. These small actions, shaped by habit and care, wove softness into the day. And when midday heat settled, slowing everyone down even further, beauty took the form of stillness. Someone sitting in the shade, letting the breeze cool their skin. Someone pausing to drink from a wooden cup, eyes half closed, breath steady. Someone resting a hand on a doorway to gather strength before returning to work. These moments of surrender, of stopping even for a heartbeat, let beauty rise gently to the surface. By late afternoon, when shadows stretched and the world's edges softened, entire scenes looked quietly elegant. A group of people walking home, their silhouettes long and swaying with fatigue. A dog trailing behind them, tail flicking lazily. A child skipping in a rhythm that matched the lengthening light. No one was performing. The world simply arranged itself into something peaceful. Inside homes, the beauty grew warmer. Firelight flickered along beams, catching faces in soft amber. A person stirring a pot moved with unthinking grace, their hand tracing the same arc it traced every evening. Someone mending fabric leaned close, lit by one small flame, their features gentle and intent. When people spoke at this hour, they spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb the shadows resting on the walls. Later, when night folded over the village completely, everything became a quiet silhouette. A person sitting at the edge of their bed, loosening a knot in their clothing. Another blowing gently on a candle flame, the last glow warming their face before darkness claimed it. Footsteps softened, voices fell away. The world held its breath in a long, steady sigh. And when they finally lay down, sinking into blankets warmed by the day's last fire, their faces carried the simplest kind of beauty. Nothing polished, nothing posed, just the calm of someone who has earned their rest. The dimness forgave every imperfection. The quiet held every breath with care. Sleep became the final softening, the final smoothing, the final glow. This was medieval beauty. Not something people pursued, not something people claimed, just something that arrived in the slow spaces of their lives, carried by dim light, quiet breaths, tired hands, and the gentle rhythm of a world that moved at half the speed of thought. A beauty meant for the hush. A beauty meant for the end of the day. A beauty that settles over you now, one quiet breath at a time. And if you drift even further into that slow medieval softness, you begin to see how beauty wasn't something people noticed in themselves at all. It was something others glimpsed in passing, often when the person wasn't doing anything remarkable. That was the nature of medieval life. Beauty appeared in the pauses, not in the preparations. Imagine someone taking a moment to rest beside a doorway, leaning a shoulder against rough timber while staring out at the quiet road. They're not posing, not even thinking. Their hands hang loosely. Their breath slows. Their hair shifts a little with the breeze. In that moment of stillness, the person looks almost like a figure from an old tapestry. Soft-edged, calm, gently folded into the world around them. That was medieval beauty, unintentional, unhurried, and entirely atmospheric. And as the day wore on, beauty settled into the small gestures people repeated without thinking. A woman smoothing a wrinkle from her sleeve before stepping outside. A man brushing dust from his boots with the side of his hand. A child adjusting the strap of a sack so it wouldn't slip. Those actions carried no vanity, only practicality. But the slowness, the quiet deliberateness, gave them a kind of gentle grace. In the marketplace, where voices stayed low and movement stayed thoughtful, the whole scene carried a soft charm. People weighed vegetables with patient hands, examined cloth in muted light, exchanged coins without hurry. Even the noise of the place wasn't sharp. It was a warm hum folding into the dusty air. A person standing in that hum, their face half lit, half shadowed beneath a simple hood, often looked more serene than any noble portrait could convey. And then there was the way people tended to animals. A shepherd guiding a sheep with a slow sweep of their arm. A woman feeding chickens with deliberate handfuls. A child gently patting the side of a tired horse. These were tender gestures in a world that often lacked gentleness. They softened the person performing them, smoothed their expression, quieted their posture. Walking home at dusk brought its own kind of beauty. Cloaks swayed in the cool air. Footsteps sank softly into earth. The sky dimmed into a long gradient that set every silhouette glowing faintly. People didn't rush. They moved with the weary ease of those who had given enough of themselves to the day. The way they shifted their weight, the way they held their baskets, the way they breathed, all of it had a quiet rhythm that made the whole scene feel like a slow-moving painting. Indoor evening tasks looked equally gentle. Someone cutting a loaf of bread with careful pressure, as though aware the knife might slip. Someone lifting a pot from the fire, arms steady, face warm with the glow. Someone pouring a drink in a small arc, the liquid catching the light before settling. These weren't gestures of elegance, but the room's dimness turned them into soft, rounded movements that made even exhaustion look poetic. And as night deepened, the world grew even slower. People spoke in near whispers. The fire breathed low, its shadows swaying like tired curtains. A person sitting cross-legged by the hearth, rubbing warmth into their hands, looked both fragile and grounded. Beautiful, not because of features, but because of presence. In that half-light, even the simplest posture carried a sense of peace. Then came the final part of the day, the settling. Someone lowering themselves onto a low bed, exhaling the last bit of tension from their shoulders. Someone folding their cloak at the foot of the blanket with a slow, practiced motion. Someone adjusting a pillow of straw before lying down, their hands moving gently in the dark. They didn't think about how they looked in those moments, but in the soft glow of embers, each gesture had a quiet dignity. And once they lay still, with the day's weight falling away bit by bit, their faces softened completely. The faint rise and fall of their chest, the slackness of tired limbs, the barely parted lips, all of it formed a calm expression the daylight never allowed. That sleeping face, framed by the dimness, was often the most beautiful a person ever appeared, not because it was flawless, but because it was sincere. This was medieval beauty, unplanned, unnoticed, and always born from the slow surrender to the rhythm of life. It lived in the quiet folds of the day, in footsteps softened by earth, in firelight brushing tired faces, in gestures slowed by weariness. A beauty meant for quiet rooms and drifting thoughts, a beauty that held people gently without ever needing to be seen. A beauty that, slowly and softly, leads you to the edge of sleep, where all things finally become calm. And if you drift even deeper into that slow medieval hush, you start to realize that beauty in that world was never a fixed quality. It was something that rose and faded with the rhythm of a person's day. A face might look weary at noon, softened at dusk, thoughtful in firelight, and almost angelic in the quiet before sleep. It wasn't about features or symmetry. It was about timing, dimness, and the way the world wrapped itself around someone without them even noticing. Even the simple act of pausing had its own quiet grace. Someone might stop on a narrow path to shift the weight of a basket, their body leaning slightly, breath slowing. In that pause, with the sky stretching pale above them and the dust settling around their feet, they looked like part of the landscape, softened by it, held by it. Medieval beauty often came from stillness, especially the kind born from necessary rest. And the rooms people lived in shaped them too. Low ceilings, warm shadows, flickering lamplight, there was no harsh illumination to sharpen flaws. A person sitting at a rough wooden table automatically looked calmer, their face half gentle, simply because the room allowed only half light. When they touched their forehead, or ran a hand through their hair, or leaned forward to listen, those movements looked almost tender, not because they were meant to be, but because they were softened by the atmosphere that surrounded them. You could see another kind of beauty in the way people handled small burdens. Someone carrying a bucket with both hands, trying not to spill a drop. Someone untangling a rope with patient fingertips. Someone climbing the last hill toward home, their breath visible in the cool air, their steps measured and steady. Effort gave their faces a tired openness, a kind of honest vulnerability that made them look more human and therefore more quietly lovely. And the beauty of companionship, of simply existing beside others, was one of the softest forms. Two people walking side by side without speaking, keeping the same slow pace. A child holding on to someone's sleeve. Friends sharing a bench, staring into the same middle distance, not because they needed conversation, but because silence felt comfortable. These small proximities created a natural warmth around people, a kind of gentle glow that didn't need decoration. As evening approached, the world loosened its grip. Work faded, voices softened, chores dwindled. A person sitting on the threshold of their home, watching the last bit of daylight slip away, looked both worn and peaceful. Their posture sagged in a way that made them seem truer, more themselves. Medieval beauty wasn't about looking fresh, it was about looking softened by the day. And when the fire was lit, everything changed again. Firelight was the great equalizer of medieval life. It smoothed lines, warmed pale skin, cast shadows that made expressions gentler. Someone sitting close to the hearth, rubbing their arms against the cold, gained a kind of warm fragility. Someone stirring a pot with slow, circular motions became the center of the room's calm. Someone leaning back in their chair, eyelids drooping, took timeless, almost like a figure from an old painting come to life. Later, when stories were shared, the listeners often looked more beautiful than the speaker. Heads tilted slightly, hands resting on wool or wood, eyes reflecting the small, moving lights of the flames. People didn't perform, they inhabited the story quietly, letting it drift into them like a soft wind. In that shared stillness, faces took on a peaceful depth. Even those who spent the entire day looking entirely ordinary now looked softened, thoughtful, settled. And then the night fully arrived. Darkness thickened in corners, the fire sank into gentle embers. People moved more slowly, their gestures pared down to the essentials, folding a blanket, placing a cup aside, smoothing their hair before lying down. These last small rituals, done without rush, carried the greatest quiet beauty of all, because they were done solely for comfort, not appearance. Finally, when bodies settled under coarse blankets and breathing eased into the slow rhythm of near sleep, faces softened into their most honest expression. No tension, no effort, no role to play. Just the quiet of a long day falling away, leaving behind a human being who had given all they had to the daylight and now let themselves drift back into stillness. This was medieval beauty at its purest, unintended, unpolished, shaped entirely by dimness, slowness, and the restful surrender that came at the end of every day. A beauty made of shadows, a beauty softened by breath, a beauty meant for the quiet just before sleep, the same quiet you're drifting into now. And if you drift even farther into that soft, half-forgotten medieval quiet, you notice something else. Beauty rarely appeared when someone was trying to look their best. It appeared when they finally stopped trying, when the world paused around them, when the light settled in the right place, when the last thread of effort loosened in their shoulders. Beauty, in that age, belonged to exhaustion more than ornament. Imagine someone returning from a long day, their steps slow along a narrow dirt path. The sky is fading into a bluish gray, the kind that softens every outline. Their cloak moves with the faintest sway, each step leaving a muted impression in the earth. They're not thinking about how they look, They're thinking about warmth, supper, the relief of sitting down. Yet, in this unguarded moment, they look quietly graceful. The day has worn them down into softness. Inside the house, the same quiet grace continues. A person lowering themselves onto a stool with a slow, careful motion looks almost ceremonial, not because they intend it, but because they're conserving the last bit of strength. Someone else, warming their hands above the fire, palms hovering in the glow, looks tender in a way daylight would never reveal. The fire paints people with patience, shading their features in warm, uneven strokes that hide weariness while highlighting calm. And in the background, the small sounds of evening fill the room. A pot settling as it cools, a faint crackle of wood, the soft sweep of a broom across the floor. Each of these sounds creates a rhythm that slows the body, drawing expressions into tranquility. A person listening to those sounds with half-lidded eyes looks almost contemplative, as though the quiet has coaxed them into a softer version of themselves. Even small gestures carried quiet beauty. Someone fixing a loose braid with slow fingers, tucking strands neatly behind the ear. Someone smoothing the front of their tunic, not for appearance but for comfort. Someone lifting a cup of warm drink with both hands, savoring the heat. These details weren't glamorous, but the slowness, the deliberate gentleness, made them beautiful in a way that felt more human than decorative. The outdoors deepened everything. Night settled over the village like a heavy blanket, and every figure walking through it became a silhouette softened by darkness. A lantern carried down a path cast a warm circle around the person holding it, turning them into a moving painting of light surrounded by deep, restful black. Their steps echoed faintly in the cool air, each step slow and soft, as though the world itself had grown sleepy. And then there were the beds, simple, low, rough, but warm. A person sitting at the edge of one, untying knots with tired precision, looked like the final chapter of the day written in human form. Their posture slumped, their breathing steady, their face relaxed into something unguarded. It was the kind of beauty that could only appear when all effort had drained away. Finally, they lay down. The blanket pulled up with a soft rustle, the body sinking slowly into straw and fabric, eyes closing not in performance, but in surrender. In that moment, the face looked peaceful, softened by dimness, warmed by the last ember glow of the room. That was the real medieval beauty, the beauty shaped by rest, by quiet, by the long exhale that comes when the world releases its hold. It wasn't a beauty meant to be admired. It wasn't a beauty meant to be captured. It simply lived in the breath between waking and sleep, in the shadows, in the hush, in the gentle unraveling of the day. The kind of beauty that settles over someone without their permission, and the kind that drifts over you too, as everything around you slowly grows quiet. And if you slip even deeper into that dim medieval calm, you start to see how beauty there wasn't something anyone aimed at. It was something that quietly happened to people when they were busy doing nothing unusual. A person didn't look beautiful because of how they arranged themselves. They looked beautiful because the world around them softened, and they softened with it. Picture someone standing near the doorway of a small house, lit only by the leftover light of dusk. They're untying the last knot in a frayed cord, fingers moving slowly with the kind of tired precision that comes after a long day. Their shoulders relax as the cord falls free and they exhale, a long, steady breath that seems to dissolve into the air. In that one breath, their entire face settles. Not radiant, not striking, just deeply, quietly human. And somehow, that simplicity is what makes them look almost tender. Inside, the evening routines unfold with the same unhurried rhythm. A person pushes a stool a little closer to the fire, the wood scraping softly across the floor. Someone else ladles stew into a roughly made bowl, their wrist turning in the same familiar arc it has traced for years. These motions don't draw attention, but they calm the room in a way that feels almost deliberate. In that warmth, even the lines of fatigue soften into something gentle. And then there is the light. Medieval lighting was never strong. It was a suggestion, not a declaration. A candle offered only a small flicker, just enough to reveal the curve of a cheek or the glint in someone's eye. A person sitting beside that thin flame looked both real and softened, their features blurred in the most forgiving way. You could stare at them for a while and still feel as though you were only seeing a quiet outline of who they were, wrapped in warmth and shadow. Outside, the night reshaped everything. Someone walking down a narrow path with only moonlight guiding their steps looked almost weightless. Their figure melted into the landscape with every step, their cloak blending into the darkness, their breath drifting into the cool air. The world was so quiet that even their footsteps seemed half asleep. And that quietness made them look peaceful, even if they'd spent the whole day working harder than they wanted to. Sometimes beauty came through sound rather than sight, the soft clink of pottery, the hush of wind pressing against wooden shutters, the low murmur of two voices in the next room. These small textured sounds had a way of slowing the body, loosening the jaw, shaping the face into something more relaxed. A person listening to those sounds, with their head tilted, their eyes lowered, looked gentler without even realizing it. Even when people were alone, medieval beauty followed them quietly. Someone rinsing their hands in a wooden basin, someone pulling a blanket from its peg and shaking it out with slow, practiced motions, someone kneeling to tuck stray kindling into the hearth for morning. These gestures were never meant to be graceful, but the slowness of life made them appear so. They were small acts of maintenance, softened by years of repetition. And when fatigue finally pulled people towards sleep, the transformation was always the same. A person sitting at the edge of their bed would pause for a moment, not from reflection, but from tiredness. Their hands rested loosely on their lap, their shoulders slumped gently, their eyes half-lidded. In that quiet pause, everything that made them look worn also made them look peaceful. Medieval beauty lived in that balance, where exhaustion turned into softness instead of strain. Lying down was another slow ceremony. Blankets pulled over limbs with a small rustle, heads sinking into straw-filled pillows, a soft breath released into the dark, the fire fading into its last embers. In that quiet, a face became almost childlike, not youthful, but unguarded. The lines of the day melted away, leaving behind the kind of expression people only wore for sleep or for moments of deep trust. And then, at last, the room settled. Darkness filled every corner. The air grew still. A person's breaths fell into a steady rhythm that matched the hush of the night. In that final stillness, the moment just before dreams, their entire presence softened into something that felt both ancient and universal. A human being resting after doing their best with the world they had. That was medieval beauty at its most honest. Not the beauty of admiration or display, but the beauty that appeared naturally when life slowed enough to allow it. A beauty that asked for nothing. A beauty made of breath, shadow, and the quiet release of a long day. A beauty that settles over you now, exactly the same way, softly, silently, without asking.